Kicking off the list at number 10, Madame de Pompadour. One of the most powerful women in the 18th century France, Madame de Pompadour is known mainly as the mistress of King Louis XV of France. The last ever portrait of her shows us a respectable, middle-aged woman piercing through your skull. Or your soul. I don't know why I said skull, it's pretty intense, but we'll keep it. Right through your skull, apparently. Since her birth in 1721, she was well educated, and quickly she became a member of the French court. She is remembered mainly as the official chief mistress of King Louis XV from 1745 to 1751. But in 1756, she was officially named the 13th Lady in Waiting. That's a pretty big deal. Over her lifetime, she became the political advisor to the king, which many historians aren't too fond of. But to be fair, she put in the work to get his attention. She would show up to his place in a carriage at night. She would put on plays, like actual productions where she was the lead. I don't know why I did Peter Pan, but hey, that's how I do it. She would perform plays about nymphs and the gods, so if that doesn't deserve a super like, I'm not really sure what does.
Number 9, Veronica Franco. Born of a merchantman and his wife, a courtesan, Veronica was destined for a movie-worthy life. Franco lived in the 1500s and her father ensured that she was equipped with a strong education. She quickly found a love for reading and writing, her poetry becoming part of her legacy later on. Sadly though, her beloved father died very suddenly, leaving her family close to ruin, and so her mother stepped in to give her a different sort of education. She was an excellent student, and though she married a much older doctor when she was just 16 years old, she was later unfaithful with the merchant, dissolving the marriage entirely. She then became known as an honest courtesan, meaning she was highly educated and could fraternize with important and dignified personnel of the time. She had a short affair with King Henry III of France. She also continued her writing pursuits and was even accepted in one of the most well-known literary circles in Venice, and 2 of her volumes were published. This is in the 1500s, keep in mind, that's incredibly rare. As a sexually free and intellectual woman, she would have made quite the stir. Sadly, she died penniless at 45 after she lost all of her wealth in the plague, but she is forever immortalized for her poetry and her philanthropy in helping old and destitute courtesans. Prior to the plague, she planned to build a safe house for them.
Number 8, Mata Hari. Birth name Margaretha Zell, this scandalous figure in history was an exotic dancer with a tragic past turned super spy. At age 27, Mata moved to Paris and reinvented herself as an artiste. As most do at that age and that time of their life, she tapped into her Dutch roots and started to perform these dance acts under the alias Lady Grecia MacLeod. She was the first dancer, check this out, the first dancer to go fully nude. Her shows of course got busy, people were into this newfound idea. She was the talk of the town, many towns for that matter, and eventually she got so good she started to tour. Yeah, like Green Day, she would tour all around. For years she would travel around Europe and perform these sold out crowds, but the most intriguing part was her clientele. These military officers and aristocrats would give her gifts after these shows. They wanted to hang out of course. They were in love after a performance like that. Mata was on board, she loved this, especially coming from a tragic, horrible marriage previously. This was the life that she needed. So around 1914 her dancing days were starting to decline, those patellas were starting to catch up to her, plus the war also broke out and things changed. Hari ended up being sent back to Holland and was later approached by Karl Kromer, German consul in Amsterdam, because the men she was in contact with were considered a valuable asset at this time. So she went from being a dancer to a spy, codename H21. That's so sick. James Bond who?
Number 7, Empress Theodora. Theodora from the brothel, as she's often known as. I don't know why, but here we are. From actress to marrying Emperor Justinian I, Empress Theodora had quite the life. The two ruled together during the golden period of the Byzantine Empire. She was the most powerful woman ever seen in Byzantium. Just like her mother, Theodora was born into the theater and would travel performing acrobatics, dancing and stripping, while also working as a lady of the night, because the two went hand in hand. She was said to have danced a particularly lurid routine with geese. Don't let your imagination run too far with that one. So how did she marry an emperor? Well, there was a tradition in the Byzantine court for emperors to marry beauty contest winners. Entrants could be from any class. But Justinian still had to amend that law that stated he couldn't marry an actress to make it happen. But she was the most beautiful, so you know, do it up. 20 years his junior, Justinian ensured she was crowned as his equal. As they were matched in intelligence, ambition, and energy, the two heralded a new era for the Byzantine Empire.
Number 6, Cleopatra. Cleopatra had some wild methods herself to get attention, you know, believing she was the goddess Isis. She tried to appear as the goddess as often as she could. So she would do so by preparing these dazzling entrances everywhere she went. She would also look fabulous. She was known as like the most beautiful queen ever for this reason. The most famous entrance she made was in 48 BC, right when Caesar arrived in Alexandria. This was an important time in ancient Egypt. There were problems with the family. She was banished at this time, but she still wanted to meet the Roman general Caesar. How do you meet the man nicknamed the bald adulterer without being seen? Well, she had herself wrapped up in a linen sack like a bowling ball and then personally hand-delivered right to Caesar's bedroom. DoorDash. See ya. I'm gonna sneak into concerts by using this method, see if it actually works. So she won the heart of Rome's future dictator. Great, and then eventually she regained Egypt's throne. Quite the play if you ask me. Now her brother wasn't too fond of this alliance, and in a following battle, he drowned in the Nile, leading to Cleopatra's ultimate return to the throne. All you gotta do is take your clothes off and jump in a sack. See ya.
Number 5, Nell Gwynn. Good old, pretty, witty Nell Gwynn. Perhaps one of, if not the most, famous actress to ever take up the stages of old. Women were not allowed to perform in theaters until King Charles II took up the throne after Cromwell banned theater altogether, because he was the worst. To bring back some spice to the world, not only did he bring back theater, he brought women to the stage, because seeing them dressed up as men was kinda hot because they wore tights. Anyways, enter Nell Gwynn, who would later become his mistress. She started out as an orange seller in his theaters, very often synonymous with being a lady of the night, but her natural wit and charm caught the eye of an actor named Charles Hart. She soon became his lover, but she soon joined the troupe as a comedic actress. She had a series of lovers before King Charles became enamored with her. Among his other love affairs, the guy was busy. She wasn't greedy, but Charles couldn't help but spoil her. She never received a title, but after calling their son a right in front of them, and she was like, what else am I supposed to call him? Their son became the Duke of St. Albans. The public adored her and was the only royal mistress in history to provoke public adoration. Once while she was in a coach, the public thought she was the Duchess of Portsmouth. Instead, she stuck her head out the window and said, "Pray good people be civil. I am the Protestant." Good for you, Nell. She died sadly just past her 30s, likely due to the lead makeup she wore. She survived the king by just 2 years, and when he died he said, "Please take care of Nell Gwynn, because she's the cutest."
Number 4, Marilyn Monroe. We've all heard her name, but do we even know why? Who was Marilyn Monroe? Real name, Norma Jean. She was an actor in LA who over time became a sex symbol. She was in numerous blockbusters around the 50s, and to this day she's still an icon. Her fame, of course, meant unwanted attention at times. Most times. Like so many celebrities now, her private life was the center of attention, and it was quite a lot to deal with alone, I'm sure, let alone the entire world watching you and judging you. The rumors going around about her and John F. Kennedy and how she was having an affair, and then she divorced her third husband right after that happened, and then just at age 36, she was found next to a bottle of Nembutal pills, which were sleeping pills. Following a celebrity's life can be pretty harmful, especially when you hold them up to this standard because they're famous or they're good looking. It's toxic. If Marilyn Monroe was alive today and this all happened now, it would probably be even worse, because now we have bored people on TikTok. So she'd probably have a worse time.
Number 3, the Marquis de Sade. Ooh, we're getting spicy. This man was so wild that people are startled to learn that he was actually real. He is the founder of the term sadism, which should say a lot about him. And he was known for his scandalous and erotic texts that the public hungered for. Donatien Alphonse Francois Marquis de Sade lived from 1740 to 1814 and died in a mental asylum. His works were banned in France all the way up till 1957. Even his very name was scrubbed from the family legacy. Descendants, along with a very interested historian, found his work bricked up behind a wall in the attic of Condé Castle. The erotica he wrote is even too extreme by today's standards. He literally held nothing back. To people who admire him, his novels are about exploring the dark hidden impulses of human nature. Sade fought hard against the civilized restraints on behavior imposed on the state, while others interpret his work as a justification for all the awful crimes he committed. 120 Days in Sodom is his most famous work, which he wrote while imprisoned in the Bastille before being let out during the Revolution. Many look back upon him today as a philosopher who challenged control and ideas, all while still making any new reader blush.
Number 2, Anne Boleyn. This was considered one of the biggest scandals ever, this entire marriage. King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were married. Anne was his second wife, and she was crowned queen in 1533, but only 3 years later, in 1536, she was charged with adultery, conspiracy against the king, and incest. Even worse, she was found guilty, and come May 19, 1536, she had her head taken off at Tower Green. Cut to today, was Anne Boleyn falsely accused? What do we know? Well, many believe that King Henry issued these charges in order to get Anne just just out of the picture. She didn't produce a male heir, and right after she was executed, King Henry married his third wife, Jane Seymour, with the main goal in mind to have a son. Now originally Anne was a member of Henry's court. She was a maid of honor to Catherine, his first wife, and in typical kingly fashion he tried to sleep around with her, but she wasn't into him initially. Now when they did get married, it was quite the task. Divorce was a no-go under the Catholic Church, so Henry argued that Anne had previously married his brother Arthur. He argued that the Pope wrongfully granted that marriage, so he found a Pope loophole. Wild.
And of course at number 1 we have Giacomo Casanova. This man left behind his colorful life story wrapped within the pages of an erotic memoir. It was so scandalous that even the censored version was put on the Vatican's list of prohibited books. But in 2011 his scandalous pages were put on display, making the public blush. But it wasn't just his tales of sex and love that would shock you, but the sheer craziness of the life he lived. He lived from 1725 to 1798 and was the son of an actress. In film adaptations with David Tennant and Heath Ledger, he is depicted as an all-out playboy with unwavering charm. But he was also a true enlightened polymath. Voltaire, Catherine the Great, Benjamin Franklin, and Mozart all hung out with this dude. He was a gambler, an astrologer, a spy, a traveler, wrote a proto-feminist pamphlet, and a science fiction novel. He basically invented the lottery, saved a man who was being accidentally killed by his doctors, he fluctuated from penniless to extremely rich to penniless at the end of his life, and wrote his memoir while working as a librarian of all things. In and amongst his adventures were over 120 notorious love affairs with countesses, milkmaids, and even nuns. Sword fights, escapes, cons, arrests, the life of Casanova made for a very interesting read. Number 10, Julie d'Aubigny, a sword-wielding opera singer? Yes, sign me up please. I am so here for this. There is so much to unpack about this story. So she was born the daughter of the secretary of King Louis XIV's Master of Horse. She moved to the court of Versailles in 1682. Her father was an expert swordsman and educated her alongside the boys he taught because she was his only kid. She even dressed as a boy and excelled at the sport. She ran off with a fencing master and toured, showing off her skills to wide audiences. One audience member, however, couldn't believe she was a woman because she was so good, so she flashed the crowd, who responded with complete stunned silence. She began singing at the Marseille Opera, where she met her first love, a young woman. This woman though was packed off to a convent by her family, and Julie followed to help her escape. They burned down the convent and ran off together, and she was actually sentenced to death by the parliament, but Julie would continue to live on, one adventure after the next. She would later be pardoned by parliament and continued to go on to become an opera star, and had many other lovers. Number 9, Betty Page. If you're a fan of pinup art, then you almost have to be a fan of the one, the only Betty Page. She is the one who defined the art form. Page was an American pinup icon who scandalized society with her risque and alternative kink modeling photos. We can thank her for the bikini, as it was Page herself who made it popular. Pop stars to this very day model themselves after her. Her iconic haircut being found on stars such as Katy Perry and Didda Von Teese. Her poses in her famous photos were found in music videos such as she had a massive amount of influence. She redefined a sexually repressed era with her free spirit and unabashed presentation of her sexuality, but she was taken advantage of a lot of the time. Betty actually didn't make any royalties after her prince until Hugh Hefner got her an agent. But by the end of the 1950s, Betty walked away after a nervous breakdown and retired as a born-again Christian. There was a lot of suffering that Betty didn't show to the world or even admit to herself. Sadly, the woman whose face everyone knew was diagnosed with schizophrenia due to severe trauma from her childhood. For years, no one knew if she had even passed away, but people were still obsessed with her until she was finally tracked down for a documentary. She refused to take any photos but would give interviews over the phone. She finally hired a lawyer to try and recoup some of the money she lost for her image and spent her final days living with her brother in LA. Number 8, Cleopatra. Cleopatra, the woman who had the world talking all the time. She made sure that whenever she entered the room, all eyes and ears were turned in her direction, jaws on the floor. She is one of, if not the most famous Egyptian queen to ever have lived. Believing she was the goddess Isis herself, she prepared dazzling entrances wherever she went. But it wasn't just her looks. In fact, some accounts say she wasn't actually particularly outstanding in that department. It was just the whole package in how she presented herself. It was indeed her wit, charm, intense intelligence that had men and nations kneeling to her. Her brother slash husband wasn't a huge fan, as it was clear she was always trying to get past him to hold the whole title. But one way she overstepped her husband was when she had herself delivered to the Roman Emperor Caesar wrapped in a carpet naked. She easily won the senior emperor and gained him as her lover, and eventually she even won the Egyptian throne, soon to become the famous Queen of the Nile. Number 7. Mary Laveau. Mary Laveau is an absolute legend in practice and by lore. Her mysterious past and practices made her the absolute talk of the town. She was the voodoo queen of New Orleans. Voodoo or Voodoo is a combination of West African religions brought over to the Americas through the slave trade. It then blended with Christianity and the traditions of indigenous peoples. Marie was the first generation of her family to be born free, but due to laws and practices of the time, Marie and her husband bought and sold around 8 slaves in their lifetime, though it was also believed that she aided in the escape of slaves as well. But what she is most famous for is her work as a voodoo queen in New Orleans. Many wealthy and politically connected individuals paid Laveau to aid in personal advice, intervention, and protection from evil energy. She also worked as a hairdresser, which gave her access to information regarding her clients because honestly, let's be honest, everyone's hairdresser is their therapist. Honestly, what didn't this woman do? She also ran an orphanage and helped many children have a safe home. Laveau is a popular figure in legend and lore due to her relationship to the occult, but her role in society was much larger and a little bit more scandalous than that. Number 6. Louisa Casati. Also known as the Divine Marquise, we have yet another woman of mystery on this list. Louisa Casati beguiled everyone she came across. She was a young, well-born heiress who married into the Lombardy aristocracy. The mundane was an insult to her. She dressed in extravagance wherever she went, dyeing her hair fiery shades, darkening her eyes with makeup and contouring with kohl. Her guiding principle in life was to imitate art, as opposed to art imitating life. But due to her extravagant presentation, she became the muse of dozens of famous artists. Thanks to her immense fortune, she traveled the world, leaving a trail of lavish parties that even Gatsby would gawk at. Every party topped the last. She had a collection of very special drugs, naked servants gilded in gold, wild animals. Her tombstone reads, "Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety." Number 5. Madam C.J. Walker. Madam C.J. Walker broke records and blasted through glass ceilings as the first self-made female person of color millionaire in America. She made her fortune thanks to her homemade line of hair care products for black women. Her parents were slaves who worked in Louisiana, but she was the first of their children to be born free after the Emancipation Proclamation. After an experience with hair loss, she created the Walker system of hair care. She had a knack for self-promotion that started by selling directly to the clients and then employed beauty culturalists to hand sell her wares. She not only continued to build her business, but she also kept a hand behind her to help lead future generations toward success. Walker used her fortune to help fund scholarships for women, donated large sums to NAACP and the Black YMCA, among other charities. An absolute legacy. Number 4. Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft is a feminist icon who began setting the groundwork for women's rights all the way back in the late 1700s. She authored A Vindication of Rights of Women in 1792, which is considered the earliest treatise advocating for women's rights. Wollstonecraft was born in the Age of the Enlightenment in England. The Enlightenment is pretty much as it sounds, an intellectual period which advocated for reason to obtain objective truths. As part of this movement, Mary and her sister founded a girls' school in London in 1784 to educate young girls. She continued to write articles advocating for the education and equality of women in society throughout her life. She believed that if women weren't educated to the same degree as men were, then society would come to a standstill. Sadly, Mary never fully saw the success of her ideas. She died during the birth of her second daughter, Mary, who, funny enough, would go on to write one of the most controversial books in history, Frankenstein. Number 3. Mae West.
I see a man in your life.
What, only one?
Mae West. As sassy as she was on screen, she was even more so off of it. Her wisecracking, quippy sensuality became a sensation people couldn't get enough of. West started out in vaudeville and Broadway before she hit the big screen, singing and doing acrobatics. By 1926, Mae began to write and produce her own plays, the first being titled Sex. Her performance was of a woman of the night, and you can imagine the stir she caused. It also earned her an 8-day jail sentence for corrupting the morals of youth. She loved to ridicule social attitudes towards sexuality, which became a part of her trademark style. She was also a big supporter of the gay community, even writing a play called Drag as a celebration of drag in New York City, on top of it being a living room comedy. As you can guess, this also stirred up some serious controversy. But despite it all, West seemed to enjoy the reaction of the private and reserved public, loving every minute that it made her famous. Number 2. Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha P. Johnson is most famously known for her work to help support the LGBT LGBTQ+ movement in New York City for nearly 25 years. Marsha played a key role in the Stonewall riots that found the gay pride movement today. She was a drag performer and black trans woman who did everything she could to advocate for trans youth, homeless people, and people living through the AIDS epidemic. She even used money she earned as a night worker to help fund a refugee for homeless people. Along with fellow activist Sylvia Rivera, she founded STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which created a safe place for homeless trans youth to sleep and feel safe. It was the first LGBTQ+ shelter in North America. Sadly, however, Johnson never got to see how far the movement would take the world, as she died in 1992. Her body was found in the Hudson River and it was ruled that she took her own life. However, many suspect foul play, as her case was never actually investigated, they just assumed. Many activists believe today that someone had indeed taken her life. Marsha P. Johnson danced, performed, and rioted her way to making the public listen to the voices people were afraid to hear, and her legacy lives on today. And last but not least, Rosa Parks. One of the loudest scandals in history that ferried in waves of change was the decision Rosa Parks made one day to stay seated on a bus. It was a scandal that transformed the world. In 1955, Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man from Montgomery, Alabama. This simple and brave refusal initiated the civil rights movement in the United States. Her actions inspired the Montgomery bus boycott, led by a young Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Up until this point, bus segregation was enforced, and the black community was forced to sit in the back of the bus always. It was also customary for bus drivers to request that black citizens give up their seat to white citizens. So one day when Parks was riding home from work, she was exhausted, the bus driver asked part of the back of the bus to stand to make room for a white citizen. Parks was the only one who refused, and she was arrested as a result. In her autobiography, Parks writes, and I quote, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in."
Number 10. Boudica. She was very tall, the glance of her eye most fierce, her voice harsh. A great mass of the reddest hair fell down to her hips. Her appearance was terrifying. Sounds awesome to me. One of the most famous queens in British history, Queen Boudica was originally co-ruler of the Iceni tribe of East Anglia alongside her husband King Prasutagus. That is, she was until the Roman governor of Britain at the time attacked. Prasutagus was killed and his lands and household were plundered by the Romans. Boudica and her daughters were rather savagely treated as well. So much so that after the fact she rose up, leading other tribes of Britons who banded together and decided to take the fight back to the Romans. The Britons captured the Roman settlement of modern-day Colchester, with the imperial agent fleeing to Gaul. They fought to London and to St. Albans, storming the cities and sending the defenders fleeing. The Britons desecrated the Roman cemeteries, mutilating statues and breaking tombstones. The Roman governor of Britain at the time, who had fled with his troops into the safety of the Roman military zone, challenged Boudica with an army of 10,000 regulars and auxiliaries. "Win the battle or perish, that is what I, a woman, will do. You men can live on in slavery if that's what you want." It's a pretty good quote. The battle was a brutal defeat though, with Boudica taking poison to avoid becoming a prisoner. Criminal to the Romans, but I mean, a hero to pretty much everyone else. Number 9. Nefertiti. Kind of hard to call this a crime, but basically Nefertiti was the wife of the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep IV. Being close to equal in power to her husband, as well as very influential in her own right, she and her husband did something quite scandalous. They decided to turn their backs on almost the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods. Sort of. They made one god the prime god of Egyptian religion during their reign. That would be the god of the sun, Aten. They moved the capital of Egypt to a new location, which they named after Aten, and they even both changed their names. He became Akhenaten, and she became, give me a sec here, Nefertiti. There's like a hyphen in there, I don't know. Both of those names, as you may have noticed, have the name Aten in them. Nobody liked this change, and it was quickly reverted after they were no longer in power. Sure was scandalous though. Number 8. Anne Boleyn. Honestly, for most of the wives of Henry VIII, it's a little hard to, well, 1, pick one, but also 2, really know if any of the things they were accused of actually happened or if they were just easy excuses. But nonetheless, here we are, and since we haven't talked about any before, why not start with the second one, who was pretty much the catalyst for Henry VIII and England breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church and forming a whole new church, resulting in the deaths of an eventual thousands of people. You see, divorce is strictly prohibited in the Roman Catholic Church, so when Henry met Anne, his wife Catherine, who had not produced him a son to carry his name, just kinda had to go, prompting the whole damn Reformation. Was it worth it? No, because the marriage lasted 3 years before she was charged with infidelity and incest, and lost her head. I kinda feel bad for anyone associated with King Henry VIII though. Number 7. Queen Didda. Queen Didda of Kashmir was quite an ambitious queen mother. Didda seized complete administrative control during her husband's reign, ultimately becoming queen regent for her son and grandsons. That ain't enough for Miss Didda here. Mere advisory for her? No sir, she despised being just an advisor, and well, she disposed of all 3 of her grandsons using medieval forms of witchcraft and torture. Yikes. How dare they make Jima their advisor? Queen Didda got what she wanted at least, as she then reigned as monarch for 23 years, being in some form of power for nearly the whole of Kashmir's 10th century. And while she may have been more than a little brutal, she was honestly one of the best and strongest rulers Kashmir has ever had. Number 6. Queen Nandi. Queen Nandi of the Zulu Empire has a story that literally sounds like it's straight out of a movie. Before the Zulu Empire ever came to become a thing at all, Nandi was impregnated by a Zulu chief in the 1700s, giving birth to a son they named Shaka. But being the 3rd wife of the chief, she and her son were often ridiculed and shamed by other chieftains. Despite all that, Nandi raised Shaka to be an extremely fierce warrior. Shaka grew up to become the Zulu chief in 1815, and Nandi became the queen mother alongside him, known in English as the Great She-Elephant. She, alongside her son, wreaked havoc on those who had mistreated her and Shaka. But since Shaka remained unmarried, it was Nandi who, funnily enough, remained the power behind the throne of the Zulu Empire throughout her lifetime. She is the reason the empire ever existed in the first place, and if any of what she did was a crime, I kinda get it. Number 5. Julia Agrippina, Nero maker. Yes, making Nero should be considered a crime. But honestly, Julia Agrippina of Rome did quite a bit more than just that, and I can see where Nero got it all from. You see, Agrippina wanted to be in power, and when her uncle, Emperor Claudius, separated from his wife due to a scandal, Agrippina saw an opportunity, no matter how messed up it seems to both us and the people of the time. Agrippina seduced her uncle, became his 4th wife, and by extension, became the empress. But it doesn't stop there. She manipulated her uncle husband into making her son Nero heir to the throne, and set up a marriage between Nero and her daughter-in-law Octavia. It's even rumored that she poisoned the food that ended her husband's life, allowing Nero to rise to power, which really bit her in the butt when Nero had her assassinated. What is this crazy family? Good God. Number 4. Queen Theodora. Queen Theodora was scandalous before she even became queen. She was involved in theater from a young age, and one of her most well-known character portrayals involved her stripping down to next to nothingness. But her acting career slowed right down when she met and married Justinian I, who was the heir to the throne of the Byzantine Empire. The two of them were as thick as thieves and ruled together, but that doesn't mean she didn't have a knack for dispatching of those who threatened her position. She was scandalous, but she did way more good than she did bad. She set up houses for ladies of the night, worked for women's marriage and dowry rights, and banished brothel keepers from the Byzantine Empire. She was also a huge supporter of monophysitism. I hope I said that right. She's even considered a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church of the modern day. Killing it, Theo. That's kind of a bad joke, actually. Number 3. The Great She-Wolf of France. Queen Isabella of France started off her queen life married to Edward II of England, who preferred the company of men to his own wife. This is obviously a precarious and possibly extremely frustrating situation to find oneself in, but she kept it bottled up and even gave birth to a son, Edward III. Until it all came to a head when her husband found a new favorite She visited France and had an affair with Lord Roger Mortimer, an exile from England. But the better twist came when Isabella, alongside Mortimer and a mercenary army, invaded England, took the throne, and she became Queen Regent for her son Edward III until he came into power. She also was probably responsible for the dispatching of her husband Edward II while he was captured. Eventually, her son would come into power, and she was imprisoned for 2 years before being allowed to live a quieter life in retirement. Number 2. Queen Fredegund. I was constantly double-taking almost the entire time I was reading about this woman. She was crazy ruthless, and all seemingly for the betterment of both her bloodline and the Merovingian kingdom. She became queen in the 5th century, marrying King Chilperic, and organizing the death of Queen Galswintha and sending Queen Odovera to a convent. When Brunhild, a big enemy for the king, and sister of the late queen, swore vengeance on them, Fredegund brutally destroyed Brunhild's husband and sisters, destroying them as in that kind of thing. The queen also made sure that all of the other heirs to the throne stopped breathing, making it a sure thing that her bloodline would occupy the Merovingian throne. Her son, Clotaire II, was only a baby when the king met his end in 587, so, of course, this ambitious queen rose up to power, fighting battles, quelling rebellions, and ensuring the smooth running of the Merovingian kingdom in her role as Queen Regent. She met her end in 597, 10 years after her husband, but Clotaire II continued in his mom's footsteps, having Brunhild and all her descendants removed from existence, resulting in 20 years of peace. So it's good. Number 1. Cleopatra. A list of scandalous queens would not be complete without one of the most well-known and famous rulers in history. Cleopatra VII Philopator was the last pharaoh Egypt ever had, reigning from 51 to 30 BC. Her life was full of scandal. When she first came into power, she was co-ruler with her husband and brother, Ptolemy XIII. But that didn't last very long, as the two did not see eye to eye, and it started a huge civil war in the country. At the same time, a conflict from Rome made its way to Egypt as well, resulting in Julius Caesar allegedly being seduced by Cleopatra and helping her end her brother's life. And again, being co-ruler with another of her brothers, also named Ptolemy, and ending the life of one of her sisters. She was also having an affair with Caesar and even produced a son with him, who became co-ruler with her after Caesar's death and after her other brother was seemingly assassinated. I'm so glad I was not a part of these families. Just death and betrayal everywhere. She then went on to seduce second Roman triumvirate member Mark Antony and sided with him when Octavian and Mark Antony engaged in the final war of the Roman Republic, which Antony lost, fighting with and alongside him until she poisoned herself to avoid being paraded through Rome and executed by the victorious Octavian.